What if we told you that one poorly planned flight could cost 62 lives? This is no accident. This is a story that should serve as a warning for the entire aviation industry. It all started like any other flight, until 30 seconds of disaster exposed 9 years of neglect, cheap repairs, and poorly planned training. What happened on January 9th would forever change Sriwijaya Air and show what happens when an airline starts cutting corners on safety. So how did one mistake turn into a tragedy that will be remembered forever? This is the story of Flight 182. You know how we do things on this channel. We start at the very beginning, with the aircraft in question. The Boeing 747-500 was 27 years old. It had been in service for Sriwijaya Air for the past 9 years. Before its employment in Indonesia, it was previously owned by Continental Airlines and United Airlines, being sold to Sriwijaya Air in 2012. The airline bought the plane as part of a larger purchase that included 14 other Boeing 747s. Sriwijaya christened the plane with the name Chitra. Chitra had flown nearly 63,000 hours and just a little over 40,000 cycles in her lifetime. But from the moment Chitra arrived in Indonesia, she was the dud of her fleet. From the very beginning, there were constant issues with the auto throttle. The auto throttle is operated manually by 2 levers, but it does make use of the autopilot system to help stabilize the plane when thrust is applied. Autopilot is turned off during landing and takeoff, and it can be disengaged at any time during the flight if a pilot feels that it's necessary. And since it's going to be important later, we need to mention here that the autopilot can be disengaged very easily with a switch on the manual throttle or by flipping a switch on the dashboard. But that being said, it can also be disengaged when a pilot applies more pressure on the throttle than the system deems necessary. In this case, it's programmed to understand that the manual force put on it is required because the pilot is aware of something that the sensors cannot pick up, like a slight tilt in the aeroplane that just needs human judgment to give it enough thrust to straighten out again. Since the very start of her time in Indonesia, Chitra had 65 separate incident reports. These reports were about the autopilot not reconnecting again after the pilots tried to switch it back on after takeoff, with 2 of those reports occurring in the week preceding the accident. The pilots also reported that the autopilot simply didn't work at all, in which case the pilots, who are trained to fly without the help of autopilot, simply relied on their own steering for the rest of the flight. Or, in the more extreme reports, the left side throttle wouldn't move in tandem with the right side, almost as if it got stuck. Since the left throttle controls the left engine and the right throttle controls the thrust output on the right side engine, well, you could imagine that this asymmetrical thrust applied to engines would cause a very unbalanced and dangerous landing and takeoff. Rising and coming down are the times when a plane needs to be at its most balanced, and even the slightest misalignment with the engine's thrust could be understandably disastrous. Every time these issues were reported, the problem would be fixed, only for it to happen again after a few months. Now, you'd think after 8 years of this problem continuing to pop up over and over again, the entire throttle and autopilot systems would just be taken out and replaced completely. Since that was terribly expensive, the call was made to either just clean the wires and tubing up, which usually solved the problem for a while, or to replace individual parts over time, hoping to find the right part that needed fixing eventually. Every diagnostic test available was run to figure out what could be making the throttle stick the way it did, but every test came back squeaky clean. The only real way to find out what was wrong was to gut the plane and do the manual fault finding. But as we now know, that was deemed too expensive. It didn't help that the airline was dealing with a great deal of restructuring and financial constraints because of their habitual mismanagement and breakdowns. And due to their cost-cutting maintenance jobs, taking that plane apart would be a colossal and expensive task that they just couldn't afford at the time. This manual to autopilot switch problem with the throttle could have been a result of dozens of different things, most of which could have been picked up by the Quick Access Recorder, or QAR for short. The QAR is essentially a black box of sorts, and it's supposed to run hundreds of diagnostic tests during a flight. The program is designed to test almost all mechanical and computer systems on the plane and store all of the data from those tests on it. It'll even send out alerts to pilots if it finds a result that is of urgent concern. But the QAR wasn't working properly at the time. Sriwijaya Air was aware of the fact that the QAR was for some reason only recording half of the diagnostic tests that it was supposed to, including the checks it was supposed to run on the throttle and autopilot systems. We can't exactly say for certain why the QAR was malfunctioning, but since it wasn't interfering with any of the flight's operational systems, they just sort of decided to forget about it. Now, if you're thinking that this is utterly negligent, well, that's not even the worst of Sriwijaya Air's budget-saving sins during its time as an airline. Not by a long shot. Just a year before, Chitra ran into a problem during takeoff that nearly resulted in a crash. Just as she cleared the runway and reached an altitude of 4,400 feet, both throttle levers moved down to apply more thrust to both engines so that the plane could stabilize for cruise. But the right throttle got stuck, while the left continued to move down as it was supposed to, causing it to apply more thrust to the right engine. This asymmetrical thrust predictably pitched the plane violently to the left, tilting the slower left wing down to a 40-degree angle. Now, the autopilot should have kicked in to rectify the unbalanced thrust, but it simply disengaged. Luckily, the captain flying that day had a good head on his shoulders. He disengaged autopilot completely and took over full manual control, getting them back up to a stability in under 7 seconds. Now, if you weren't angry before, then you'll definitely be angry now. This incident, which nearly caused the plane to go into a complete flat spin, was not officially reported, and the QAR did not save this event's data because it was already malfunctioning at the time. So there's no way to exactly know why the throttle and autopilot acted the way they did. And to put the cherry on top of the cake, it later came out that this happened to 6 other pilots flying Chitra 2. Every time the pilots reported it, Chitra was quietly taken to a hangar where her wiring was cleaned up a bit and she was sent right back out. No incident reports were filed at all. And on a final note, Sriwijaya Air was behind on its annual pilot simulation and performance checks. You see, Indonesia was included in the new Global Aviation Board's expectations that all pilots must undergo competency tests and simulations every 6 months or so. But the Indonesian government hadn't yet made these training programs available to airlines yet. Sriwijaya Air had every opportunity to implement these new standards to their staff if they wanted to. But since it wasn't quite yet a national expectation, they weren't required to adhere to any of these new rules. Well, legally at least. The pilots on board Chitra were 2 years behind on the new competency checks, and the last ones they'd done were a year ago, and those simulations were done by the old system. Both captain and co-pilot passed their inadequate testing with satisfactory results, but since they were doing old, outdated simulations, well, there were no emergency response tests even included in them. So if they were ever faced with an unexpected set of events, they just weren't sufficiently prepared to respond with quick reactionary times. With that said, let's look at the pilots, passengers, and the conditions at Jakarta Airport on the 9th of January 2021. A 54-year-old Captain Afwan just so happened to be the same pilot that reported that near-death experience in this very plane a year before. He had 17,904 flight hours on his record, with half of them being behind the yoke of a Boeing 747. With this long career in the air, which included time in the Indonesian Air Force, it's not surprising that he'd managed to get control back on that previous incident. But as we'll soon learn, expertise and luck can only buy us so much time. Afwan would have assumed that the problem that had caused his close call before had been fixed. No self-respecting airliner would send a faulty plane that nearly caused the deaths of a plane full of people back in the air. Now, would they? But just the fact that Afwan was able to get Chitra back to stability in an already impossible situation once proves that he was an outstanding flyer. Captain Afwan is not to blame for what was about to happen, that's for sure. Next to Afwan was First Officer Diego Mamahi. The 34-year-old had 5,107 flight hours, the majority of which was on the Boeing 747. 50 of the 62 people on board were passengers, and among those 62 were 7 children, 6 employees of the airline that were using their free flyer miles to travel, and the other 6 were on duty as stewardesses and an engineer. The flight was scheduled to leave from Soekarno-Hatta International Airport at 1340 and expected to land at Supadio International Airport in the city of Pontianak at 1500. Unfortunately, this was in the middle of monsoon season, and a storm was in the process of blowing itself out. So for obvious safety concerns, takeoff was delayed by an hour. Chitra had flown 4 other domestic flights that day, with no discernible problems in that very storm. It was still raining when they were cleared for takeoff, as well as another Boeing 747 that was stationed just behind them. By now, the storm had abated by enough that it couldn't even be classified as a storm anymore. They cleared the runway and Afwan engaged the autopilot, both on the dashboard and on the throttle lever at 14:36. The wheels retracted and they were officially in the air. Everything was by the book so far, including air traffic control communications. Oh, and we should mention here that another coincidental malfunction, if you can call systems going haywire because the plane hadn't been serviced properly a coincidence, most of the cockpit recordings are just simply missing. So all we have to go on are the testimonies from air traffic control and from the bits and pieces from the black boxes that weren't working properly either. At 14:42, the co-pilot requested to turn to the right to avoid the last of the storm, deviating slightly from his intended course. He was cleared to take his new route, the coordinates were edited, and off they went. ATC did instruct them to stay at 11,000 feet so that Chitra and the plane that was following behind them wouldn't cross over each other's paths. At 10,900 feet in the air, the nose of the plane was at a 4.5-degree angle. Afwan prepared to get them level again, and then suddenly the autopilot disengaged, and without its assistance, it's assumed that the same throttle lever got stuck again, repeating almost to the letter the exact same set of conditions that Afwan was faced with in this very plane just a year ago. The flight recorder data that we could get from it later indicated that the left throttle stabilized for cruise, meaning that it decreased its speed while the right continued to apply thrust that would be needed for a rise. The cruise thrust monitoring system, the program designed to warn pilots of a thrust discrepancy, did not alert the pilots that this uneven thrust was happening. We can only put this down to even more bad maintenance. Either the program wasn't operating or the sensors outside feeding the program information was faulty, but there's no way to know for sure now which one it was. There are screens monitoring both engines' output and performance on the dashboard, but both Afwan and Mamahid had their eyes on the stormy weather outside, so they just didn't notice what was happening, and they simply relied on the autopilot to work as it was intended to guide them through the already challenging conditions. If they'd been looking at the dashboard, they'd have noticed the left engine was at 49% thrust, the right amount for cruise speed, while the right engine was at a full 92%, the same amount needed for takeoff. They would have also seen that Afwan was turning right with his yoke to get out of their left turn, along with the right side engine thrusting at almost full speed, exacerbating their force to that side. The next 30 seconds goes by fast, and it's also the only cockpit recording we have of the entire flight. It reflects the absolute confusion and split-second chaos that descended on the plane, the passengers, and the pilots. If that went by too fast for you, let's explain. When Chitra was pulled out of her rise and Afwan attempted to stabilize her for cruising speed by turning to the right to get out of the left turn, the plane had reached her limit. A warning bell finally went off in the cockpit, alerting the pilots that something was terribly wrong. But before they could even react, the internal programming of the plane, without the use of autopilot, was trying to stabilize them by overcompensating to the left to make up for that overthrust on the right. When the correction finally won its fight against the right side engine and Afwan's right-hand turn, it violently pitched Chitra to the left, no less than 45 degrees. This severe angle and incredibly fast rotation would have thrown everyone inside against their windows and seats. If the flight attendants weren't buckled up, they would have been yanked off their feet too. Afwan pressed his yoke harder to the right, instead of pulling the right side throttle out of its stuck position, just making the situation even worse. If the little data that we do have is trustworthy at all, it seems like most of the faulty systems that had failed up to this point did kick back into action. But by this time, it was too late. That 45-degree pitch was enough to put Chitra's nose down by 90 degrees, causing her to streak towards the surface of the Earth with its right engine propelling them at full blast. Fighting the controls against this kind of speed should have been humanly impossible. Afwan tried to pull the yoke towards him to get the nose up in a last-ditch attempt to do something, anything, to get them out of this freefall. And miraculously, he managed to get Chitra back up to a 0-degree angle, a perfectly straight arrow. But their altitude by now was still too low, and they were falling out of the sky like a cork. The window to correct the problem was gone. It was too late. The line cut off and Chitra disappeared from both radio and radar. Just like that. 20 miles from takeoff and 30 seconds from the moment that they realized that there was even anything wrong, things went from perfectly fine to absolute chaos, both for the pilots and for the ATC operator on the other end of the line. It's been speculated that they struck the Java Sea at 400 knots, maybe even more, hitting the surface of the water right on the belly of the plane. Hitting the water at that speed from a flat position makes the surface of the water as solid as a brick wall. Think of it as the ultimate 200-ton belly flop. The instant they collided with the ocean, Chitra was pulverized to shreds. Needless to say, all of the 62 souls on board perished instantly. The first pieces of the wreckage were found almost immediately, but sadly, retrieving all of the pieces and bodies took 3 whole months to complete. Weather, murky water, and the sheer amount of scattered debris are the main reasons for the unusually long time it took to collect everything. The CVR recording unit that collected all the radio communications and cockpit recordings was in pieces. The outside casing was found ripped apart, with its innards lying somewhere on the ocean floor. Eventually, those parts were located, but as we now know, it barely saved any of the data it was supposed to. All they got from it was the final harrowing 30 seconds of Chitra and her passengers. The final verdict shouldn't come as a surprise to any of our listeners that Sriwijaya Air was declared responsible for the incident due to their cost-cutting repairs, lack of proper maintenance and training, and the pilot's failure to keep an eye on their monitoring systems. But this was directly correlated to the training they should have received that Sriwijaya did not give them. The airliner had been aware of Chitra's issues for more than a decade. She'd racked up 65 complaints about the exact same issue and had a near-fatal incident behind her. Yet she was sent out again and again and again. The only silver lining to this terrible tragedy is that Sriwijaya Air was gutted from the office to the working floor in light of this event. In this modern day, it's unheard of for any airliner to operate by its own rules and systems. That's why companies like Boeing and Airbus have regulatory bodies that keep their planes and the pilots that fly them under strict quality expectations. A country's government where the airline is situated also needs to oversee the maintenance and pilot standards of its airliners. These bodies were created to make a chain of command so that these negligent oversights and cost-cutting actions do not take place. Boeing's had too many blemishes on their reputation in the last few years to allow this to ever happen again. For now, Sriwijaya Air is still going through the lawsuits, new allegations, and whistleblowers coming out every few months. They've sold off around 75% of their fleet, but they are still very much operational. How long that will be is for anyone's guess, though. Already, the lawsuits from the families, authorities, and former employees have bankrupted the airport, and it's only a matter of time before someone buys them out or offers them a merger. Either way, we're glad that the upper management, CEOs, and department heads that ran the airline will probably never work in aviation again. Or at least, we sure hope so.